Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls, and welcome to week 4 of the update 46 PTS. I did not do videos in weeks 2 and 3 because, well, it didn't really seem worth it. We got a bunch of changes to the trial, a load of bug fixes, and a few tweaks to the combat system, but no major adjustments to subclassing as it stood in week 1. Now that's finally changed. We're getting quite a lot of combat changes in week 4, although maybe not the shakeup that many players had been expecting. That just leaves one more week of PTS changes going by previous test cycles and 4 weeks before these changes go live on June the 2nd. One of the biggest changes we have to talk about right away is reclassifying all beams as direct damage. That primarily means Fate Carver and Radiant Destruction. I'm not sure exactly why they made this change, but it's probably for clarity as much as anything else. For years, people have been asking whether beams are dots or direct damage, and I suppose it makes sense that they should be considered direct damage because all the damage occurs up front while you're casting it, unlike a dot where you cast it and then move on, letting the damage play out over the duration. I would have suggested that this might be a way to rein in the power of Fate Carver alongside Azure Blight, which has been such a ridiculously powerful and popular combo for such a long time, but they already nerfed that set pretty hard, so I'm not sure that reason holds up. Either way, Fate Carver no longer procs Azure Blight or Runecarver's Blaze, it won't be buffed by the Necromancer's Rapid Rot passive, and Arcanists will almost certainly be switching their blue champion point to Master at Arms instead of Thaumaturge. Also, that new craftable set in the new zone, which buffs all of your direct damage, that's going to be pretty juicy with Fate Carver setups now. Although it's worth noting that Deadly Strike will still work with Fate Carver and Radiant Oppression because that buffs channels as well as dots. We'll see what more ramifications this might have down the line. Moving on to the classes. Arcanist. Just one change here to Arcanist's domain, and not to what it does but how its buffs, Minor Courage, Fortitude, Intellect and Endurance, are assigned to players standing in it. If you remember, in week 1, it was changed to affect only 6 allies, down from 12. And since then, there's been some concern about its sorting behavior and how groups can ensure that everyone is going to get these buffs. The heal always goes to the 6 players with the lowest health and will stay on them for the duration. But the buffs have been going to whomever was closest to the caster when the AoE is dropped. Now they're changing this to whomever enters the area first. This makes sense and it does add a bit of clarity, but still leaves some pretty important questions. For example, if I cast my domain right on top of the stack, everyone's already inside it, nobody walks into it, who gets it? Is that still based on proximity to me? And if another player drops their domain on top, does it automatically smart target those that do not already have the buffs? It seems like a minor detail, but it's crucial to how this ability is going to be used in organized groups, so this will warrant a bit more investigation. By the way, big shout out to Icky Piggy for tirelessly testing many of these things. I've been doing a lot more testing of synergies and targeting recently at Ninja Pulls, and it is kind of a nightmare. It can get very convoluted and time consuming, so we should be grateful to anyone who takes the time to really test this stuff, verify their findings, and share them with everyone. We definitely could use some more clarity on Arcanist's domain, because if we can't guarantee these buffs to our entire group, that's gonna suck, and I assume that's what this change aims to accomplish. It's just not that clear in the patch notes. Overall, I think Arcanist still looks okay. All 3 of its skill lines are going to be fairly attractive, but it's interesting that the devs aren't touching Fate Carver in week 4 after they buffed it to everyone's surprise in week 1. But so much of the damage data being gathered on PTS is on the dummy, and that's not exactly where Fate Carver shines, so it may be that some downward adjustments are coming. I know a lot of players would be really glad to get out of that Fate Carver meta we've been in for so long. We'll see how things go. Dragonknight. They lowered the cost of a bunch of abilities to offset the weakening of the Dragonknight's sustain passives, such as Combustion and Battle Roar, that we saw in week 1, and which made some people very mad. I feel like I get those nerfs and why they exist, because now those passives are available to everyone, it made sense to tune them down. But making the Ardent Flame abilities cheaper is a welcome way to compensate and make that skill line a bit more appealing. Specifically, Searing Strike becomes 23% cheaper, Engulfing Flames becomes 15% cheaper, and Noxious Breath now applies the poison status effect to all enemies hit, guaranteed, which is low-key a pretty juicy buff against multiple targets, and will effectively lower its cost as well, since Combustion restores 423 Magicka and Stamina whenever we apply Burning or Poisoned, so long as it's not on cooldown. That's still less than half of what it used to do, but hey, it's something. Burning Talons also becomes 17% cheaper, although it's still a great damage ability stuck in a skill line that damage dealers are not going to be particularly interested in. As I've said repeatedly on this channel and on Twitch, this is something they're going to have to look at with subclassing going forward. The Dragonknight looks fairly competitive for subclassing, but there are definitely still things they could do, such as moving Talons to Ardent Flame, maybe instead of Fiery Grip, for example, or do the opposite and spread the damage, healing, and tanking abilities out a bit more, so there's more balance and creativity involved in choosing which skill lines to use. We'll come back to this idea in a minute. And maybe continuing to tweak the new effect of the Warmth passive, where Ardent Flame abilities cause the target to take more damage from all your dots. Necromancer. The Pummeling Goliath Bash was not working properly with subclassing, only with OG Necromancers. That's now been fixed. Necromancer overall seemed to come out of week 1 relatively well, so I guess there weren't many urgent things to fix here. Sorcerer. Remember how Bound Armament's damage was nerfed by 10% in week 1? Well, they reverted that change. The double stacks remain, they just got rid of the damage reduction, which is the right call if you ask me. Dark Exchange now breaks stealth, presumably to plug a potential issue with this skill being used alongside Shadowy Disguise. The synergy from Lightning Splash and its morphs can now be self-synergized, and that's it. Again, this leaves most of the gripes about the Sorcerer unaddressed from week 1. That subclassing makes Daedric summoning look a lot less appealing because of all those fancy new class abilities on offer to us. Having to give up 4 whole slots just for the pets feels like a real bummer, and Daedric Prey not buffing any pets besides Sorcerer pets kinda goes against the whole pitch of subclassing, even if the ability is stronger than it was. And of course, just like the Dragonknight's Talons, keeping Crystal Fragments locked up in a skill line without any other juicy damage tools puts it in an awkward spot where it's quite unlikely to get used. Templar. This is a big one. Radiant Destruction has had its channel time reduced from 4.8 seconds to 3.8 instead. It's a bit cheaper, hits a little harder, and has a higher chance than ever to trigger the overcharged status effect, which is nice. The execute threshold has also been raised to 33%, and the Radiant Glory morph is now even cheaper but with less healing, which is very welcome since stamina characters have really struggled to sustain this on the PTS. The Radiant Oppression morph now kicks in at 40%. Now obviously we need to test this and play around with it before making any verdict, but Zos were definitely right to do something here. The changes in week 1, making the beam super long but much weaker in terms of damage per second, was just a bit of a weird move. Everyone loves the Templar beam. It felt like one of the few abilities in the game which should perhaps just be left alone because it's so iconic, and although it's obviously very powerful, it's also kinda situational, so it doesn't throw the meta completely out of whack. So in a way, nobody wanted to change this, but Zos had to change it because of subclassing. The stated goal with these changes to Radiant Destruction was to make it more accessible, so it wouldn't need to be activated constantly. But let's be real, pressing a button every 2 seconds is not constant. That puts almost zero pressure on any player. The other stated reason was PvP, where I guess a ranged execute with massive ramping damage and an undodgeable channel did seem a little bit too free, and finally, to give the ability some drawbacks so it wouldn't be too unbalanced in a post-subclassing world, and avoid a situation where every build grabs Dawn's Wrath just to have this execute on their bars because it's so freaking strong. When it was still confined only to the Templar, whose pre-execute damage wasn't the best, it was okay to have this really crazy execute. That's the trade-off. But once you remove those limitations, the existing version of the skill becomes obviously broken. Players saw this problem coming a mile away, and so did the devs, so they tried to fix it. But here's the problem with all of these goals: accessibility, the need to balance subclassing, and unifying PvP and PvE. They're all reasonable goals on the face of it, but they all have a tendency to make a game more bland. If everything is made super easy to use by even your grandma who's never played ESO before, if power is trimmed right back to the point where no skill line is allowed to be an outlier, and where all of our tricks in PvE also have to be balanced and fair in PvP, well, you make it very hard to keep any kind of spice or variety in your game. It's not impossible, but when your game has for 11 years relied on the separation of classes to create a lot of its vibe, clearly this is going to be a challenge. And it seems like ZOS have given themselves an enormous task with this, to keep everything balanced and keep everyone happy, but still make class abilities interesting to use. In a way, Radiant Destruction perfectly demonstrates the challenges and the drawbacks of bringing subclassing to ESO. For now, I suspect players will be receptive to this week's changes, but I also suspect the overall change in direction for the Templar beam will remain unpopular. But hey, it'll make a good test case, and hopefully the devs will keep tinkering with it until we can get something which feels good to use and is powerful enough to justify the Dawn's Wrath skill line, but which isn't so busted that everyone wants it. I think if ZOS can get this one right, there's a lot more hope for subclassing in the long run. Warden. Just one change here to the Piercing Cold passive, which used to increase all our damage done, but was changed in week 1 to only increase frost damage by 10%. Definitely a disappointing change for a lot of players, but now they're raising that to 15%, which is a pretty chunky amount. And the devs say this is in recognition of the fact that it's not that easy to stack good sources of frost damage and to be an effective damage dealer in all the usual ways. So until they can find better long-term solutions, like more sources of frost damage in general, they're just gonna juice up this passive to make Winter's Embrace more of a contender. Warden is a bit easier for the devs to deal with, since all of the added classes, the non-base game ones, Warden, Necromancer, Arcanist, have skill lines which are fairly neatly divided between damage, healing, and tanking. So they don't suffer from as many weird outliers like Crystal Fragments or Burning Talons, classic damage abilities which suddenly find themselves totally sidelined by subclassing. Still, Winter's Revenge and the whole Frost theme was always a Warden calling card, and I don't think the devs or the players would want to see it phase out of the damage toolkit. So again, there's some more head scratching and some ingenuity needed to make subclassing live up to its promise. To be honest, I still don't know what to make of subclassing. It is a cool idea, and maybe ESO should never have had classes to begin with, as the comments section is obsessed with pointing out. We all get that, it's a totally fair point, but a much more relevant point is that, like it or not, ESO did launch with classes, and has refined and depended on that system for 11 years. To abruptly remove all that structure from the combat system overnight, it's like a train going off the rails and down a new track which hasn't been built yet. So the devs now have to hurriedly put down the tracks in front of the speeding train, to cite the classic metaphor. I'm sure that's probably what MMO development feels like most of the time, but this seems particularly reckless, given how many kinks there are to iron out. And I can't help but wonder if this system could have used a bit more time in testing, maybe even an off-cycle on the public test server, so there's no hard deadline like there is here. We know they've done that before, but then again, maybe the devs are thinking that we're looking at a worst-case scenario of 3 to 6 months where balance is a little bit whack and power is way too high. It's not going to kill the game, it's just not a good look, or a good experience for the players. But hey, there's a bit more time left on PTS. Before we move on completely, I just want to return to this idea that we should spread out the abilities for damage, healing, and tanking so there are some in every skill line. It might sound weird at first, and you might think, what? I don't want a bunch of support abilities on my DD. No way! I like being able to look at skill lines like Assassination, Herald of the Tome, or Gravelord and see that yes, this is packed with damage stuff, this is a skill line I can use. I totally get that. It is nice when things are easy to understand in a video game. But ever since subclassing was announced, there's been a load of chatter about pure classes being left behind because they just won't be able to compete. Power creep, or in this case more like power blowout, which creates even more issues down the line, the continued narrowing of the meta in both PvE and PvP, and the loss of class identity, and that rock, paper, scissors style trade-off of setting up a character that had strengths as well as limitations, and that's what defined it and made it interesting to play. Literally all of these concerns and criticisms could be somewhat addressed by breaking up the skill lines which are focused solely or mostly on damage, healing, or whatever. I know it would be a ton of work for the devs, but as we've discussed, they're probably looking at a ton of work anyway to make subclassing a genuine win for all players. I don't want to oversell it, but I do know that Skinny Cheeks is also a fan of this idea, and it would definitely make subclassing a bit more varied and interesting. Right now, it's just so obvious which skill lines are going to be best for each role, give or take based on the situation. And whatever role we happen to be playing, most of the skill lines can just be ignored. We won't even look at them because there's nothing there for us. I wish I had mentioned this concept in week 1 because it's something I really want the devs to consider. Sure, it would be a lot of work and class skill lines might have to be renamed and changed quite a bit, but isn't that the whole point of subclassing? To overhaul the class system? In that case, let's do it properly and make a better game for everyone. Moving on to other changes unrelated to classes, the new trial sets got tweaked, thank goodness. Harmony and Chaos, the light damage set which buffs you whenever you take a synergy, got increased from 86 to 135 weapon and spell damage per stack, almost a 60% increase. The new maximum is 675 weapon and spell damage. It's still going to be tricky to keep it at max stacks, but at least it now seems worth looking into, whereas before it was way too weak. Caspian's Cruel Signet, the medium damage proc set which drops swords on top of your enemies. It got a 98% damage buff, a hilarious amount. But the damage was terrible. I ran it in the new trial in week 1, and the DPS from this proc was absolutely pitiful. It's way bigger now, it can now crit, and they've also changed the way it works, increasing all your damage done for each sword instead of just the proc damage. This means it could be very strong in crowded fights. Maybe not trash pulls, because you'll need at least 7 seconds to proc it, and a lot of trash pulls will be mostly or completely obliterated by that point, at least in groups with good damage. Also take note that it procs off direct AoE damage and only has a cooldown of half a second. So now that Fate Carver is considered direct damage, this could well be a contender to replace Azure Blight in some fights, although it works very differently, and could work especially well with abilities like Fate Carver and Biting Jabs. Speaking of Azure Blight, the change to Fate Carver might pave the way for that set to come back, but we'd really need to stack dots to reap its rewards as opposed to just beaming for free damage. We'll see. Recovery Convergence, the light support set, also got its cooldown massively reduced. The tank set didn't get any changes because, as I said in week 1, numerically that one seemed fine already. Other set changes. Pearls of Elnafay now grants Major Heroism for 1.5 seconds instead of a unique ulti-gen bonus. That doesn't really make it any weaker, it just means you can't stack it with other sources of Major Heroism. Pillager's Prophet got a huge nerf, reducing the amount of ultimate it grants per tick from 5% to only 2%. Now the scale of this nerf kinda depends on the cap. With the new version of the set on PTS, if your Pillager's healer fires it at 200 ult, you'll only get 4 ultimate per tick instead of 10. Or if they fire it at 400, you'll only get 8 instead of 20, which is obviously a huge drop. But 400 ult was also the old cap, and if they've kept that, then 8 ultimate per tick instead of 20 is going to be the new maximum, which is rough. But if they remove that cap, then we could get up to 10 ult back per tick, so long as our healers are firing the set with 500 ultimates stored up. Then the nerf won't be quite as bad. And anyway, Ultigen is going to be easier after subclassing, so this is clearly aimed at reining in some of the crazy power creep we're obviously going to get next update. I'm not sure how I feel about this one. There are more great support sets in the game than there were a few years ago, but there still aren't that many really great ones, and this nerf might be heavy enough to put Pillagers in the maybe pile for longer fights. Nerfing supports is probably my least favourite way to rein in damage, but again, we'll have to test it and check what they've done to the cap. Finally, they made a bunch of adjustments to the new trial, Ossian Cage. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but I think the general feedback has been that the setting and visuals are spectacular, the mechanics are cool, as ever, but Boss 1 is way too easy, which isn't changing this week. Boss 2 was a little too difficult after they buffed it, and now in week 4 they've made a bunch of tweaks to rein that in a bit, while Boss 3 was also disappointingly easy, but has also had a number of adjustments this week to make it feel more appropriately challenging. Obviously for most players and most groups, the hard modes will already be tough enough, but the latest, most challenging hard mode content should always be balanced for the upper end of what's possible in organized groups. That's just how it has to be, otherwise the endgame dies. That's going to be it for the combat changes. There's the usual flurry of bug fixes and other corrections, but you can read through those in the patch notes if you want. I didn't want this video to get too long. The changes themselves mostly seem fine, but I gotta say it's the lack of changes in some areas that is starting to worry me. I just don't have the sense that subclassing is in the bag yet, and making big changes on the live server is way more disruptive, so it'd be better if that could be avoided. Still, my impressions are partly subjective, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys think. There is still so much more for us to do on subclassing. I've already got a bunch of setups for organized trial groups, maximum dummy damage for the lols, but also based around certain themes or rotations which are very easy to learn and which may not be quite meta, but which really aren't that far behind. It is going to be a little weird figuring out how to even make guides for ESO post subclassing. But hey, Ninja Pulls will be here, as always, breaking down the information to make it accessible to everyone, helping you figure out what works best, hosting teaching trials for you to practice, and generally helping you crush this game and have as much fun as possible with it. So before you go, if you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to this channel, and if you can, it's good to support the content that you enjoy. A massive thank you to those who do, and if you'd like to join them and chip in, you can become a monthly supporter here on YouTube, Twitch, Ko-fi, or Patreon. We depend on it and we are super grateful for it as well. Update 46 goes live on June the 2nd, and we've got one more round of PTS patch notes next week. And with that, I will say thank you for watching, and see you then.